autumn of 1867, federal investigators entered a lonely stretch of the Missouri Ozarks, expecting to find nothing more than an abandoned trading post. What they uncovered instead would cast a shadow over the region for generations. Beneath the rough-hewn floorboards of Sullivan's establishment lay hidden ledgers, written in precise Irish script. Each page listed travelers by name, their physical descriptions, the routes they intended to take, and, most chilling of all, their estimated wealth. One entry ended with the words, "Expected return, none." Another noted in cold calculation, "Gold recovered, $2,400. The final entry, dated only 2 weeks before discovery, mentioned a German prospector named Zimmerman, traveling alone with nearly $8,000 in dust. Scribbled in the margin was a line that revealed both intent and urgency. "We finish this one, then leave Missouri for good." To the agents present, it became clear they had stumbled upon more than records of commerce. They had uncovered evidence of a vast, organized machine of murder, one that had thrived under the cover of respectability. This revelation ignited whispers across the hills and valleys of the Ozarks. Families who had waited endlessly for husbands, brothers, or sons to return suddenly saw in those ledgers the cruel explanation for their loved one's silence. The Sullivan brothers, Patrick with his silver tongue and Shaw with his brute strength, had turned hospitality into a trap and a trading post into the heart of a killing ground. The story that follows is not merely about crime. It is about how evil can wear the mask of trust and how an empire of death can rise in plain sight. Before we continue with this haunting tale, make sure you subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. In 1867, the Ozarks were a land untouched by the full reach of federal law. While the Civil War had ended 2 years earlier, its scars were still fresh, and the region's lawlessness made it a haven for those who preferred the shadows to the light. The federal government struggled to maintain control, and local authorities were often more concerned with their own survival than upholding justice. It was in this chaotic environment that the Sullivan brothers, Patrick and Shaw, would make their mark, though not in the way anyone could have imagined. The Ozarks, with its rugged terrain and dense forests, was a land of opportunity for men of a certain type. For years, it had been a place where bandits and Confederate guerrillas hid, but as the war drew to a close, a new breed of outlaw would rise. These men were not just driven by desperation or ideology, but by the promise of wealth and power in a land where the rule of law had all but vanished. The Sullivan brothers were no different. Patrick, the older of the two at 32, was a man of sharp intellect and charm. Born in County Cork, Ireland, he had seen the horrors of war and understood the power of information. He was a natural leader, able to persuade even the most cautious of travelers to trust him within moments of meeting. His younger brother, Shaw, was built like a prizefighter and lacked Patrick's finesse, but he made up for it with his brute force and quick temper. He was the muscle to Patrick's mind, ensuring that those who were less inclined to talk could be persuaded in other ways. The brothers arrived in the Ozarks in the spring of 1864, having served in the 9th Missouri Infantry during the war. They were not unfamiliar with violence, but they saw the region's turmoil as a chance to build something more lasting, something that would make them wealthy beyond their dreams. They set up a trading post at a strategic location called Hellhound Crossing, where the main road from Joplin to Springfield intersected with the Devil's Backbone Trail, a treacherous shortcut through the heart of the Ozarks. This position was perfect. It allowed them to avoid federal patrols while still being close enough to catch the flow of weary travelers passing through the region. The trading post itself was a modest building, a simple log structure with a false front that made it appear more significant than it truly was. Inside, it offered basic supplies to passing travelers: food, water, and shelter. But what made the Sullivan brothers' business stand out was their ability to make every traveler feel like they were receiving something special. Patrick's charm made people believe that they had found a trusted ally in the wilderness, while Shaw's presence ensured that no one would question their hospitality. The brothers knew that trust was a valuable commodity in these wild hills, and they used it to their advantage. While the region's economy was in disarray, there was one bright spot: the return of gold prospectors from the California gold rush. The boom had tapered off, But many men who had made their fortune in the Sierra Nevada were now traveling back home. They carried not only gold but also the wealth from years of hard labor, and many of them chose to pass through Missouri on their way east. These men, wealthy and often traveling alone, were the perfect targets for the Sullivan brothers. What the people of the Ozarks didn't know was that the brothers had spent their first year in Missouri not building their business, but building a network, a web of information, manipulation, and corruption that would soon make their trading post the epicenter of one of the most profitable criminal enterprises the Ozarks had ever seen. The Sullivan brothers understood something that few others did. That information, when carefully gathered and exploited, was more valuable than gold. They learned everything about the travelers who came through Hellhound Crossing, who they were, where they were headed, and most importantly, how much money they carried. Patrick would charm the information out of the travelers, while Shaw made sure that those who might be suspicious stayed quiet. The brothers would then use this knowledge to guide their victims to a route where they could be easily robbed, or worse. The first whispers of something sinister came in October 1864, when Martha Hensley, the wife of a local farmer, overheard a disturbing conversation outside Sullivan's trading post. She had been delivering eggs to the brothers' establishment when she arrived just past sunset, carrying her basket in the crisp autumn air. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the day's fading light cast long shadows over the trees. As Martha approached the back entrance of the trading post, she heard voices through the thin log walls. At first, it was just the familiar sound of Patrick's lilting Irish accent, mixed with another voice she didn't recognize. The stranger, a German man, spoke with urgency, his words cutting through the evening stillness. Left here 3 days ago with enough gold to buy half of Springfield. Took the Devil's Backbone route like you suggested. Should have reached the main road by now, but nobody's seen him. Martha froze at the door, her hand just inches away from knocking. Patrick's response, when it came, sent a shiver down her spine. Well, that trail can be treacherous, especially for a man traveling alone. Wild country out there. Anything could happen, bandits, accidents, animals. Who's to say? Patrick's voice sounded light, almost too light. The stranger was insistent. It's too convenient. Every time you send someone that way, they disappear. There was a long pause before Shaw's deeper voice cut through the air, carrying a quiet but unmistakable threat. You questioning our judgment? Because if you are, maybe you should take your concerns to Sheriff Dalton. I'm sure he'd be very interested in hearing about your doubts. The conversation grew tense, and Martha, feeling the weight of the words, quickly stepped back from the door. She had heard enough. As she left, her mind raced with the implications of what she had just overheard. But who could she tell? Sheriff Dalton was a frequent drinking companion of Patrick's. The federal marshals rarely made their way through these parts. And even if she did bring the conversation to someone's attention, what could she prove? She had no concrete evidence, only suspicion and innuendo. That night, Martha decided to keep the conversation to herself. She hoped it was just a misunderstanding, but in the back of her mind, a nagging feeling remained. It wasn't long before the pattern she had heard about in passing began to emerge in full view. Over the following weeks, more travelers disappeared along the Devil's Backbone Trail. The brothers' names were whispered among the missing, their trading post becoming a dark crossroads for men with gold who would never reach their destinations. Soon, rumors began circulating through the Ozarks that the Sullivan brothers might be involved in something far darker than simple business dealings. Still, without evidence, the whispers remained just that, whispers. But those whispers would soon grow louder. In December 1864, a man named Frederick Steinbeck, whose brother-in-law, Klaus, had disappeared while traveling through Missouri, began his own quiet investigation. His search would lead him back to the trading post, where he would find a story that seemed too plausible to be true, but not true enough to be ignored. By the winter of 1864, the mystery of the missing travelers had become impossible to ignore. The pattern was disturbingly clear. A prospector would arrive at Sullivan's trading post, usually traveling alone or with a single companion, and after spending several hours speaking with the brothers, they would leave, often with maps and directions to the Devil's Backbone Trail. Days later, they would vanish without a trace. No one could explain it. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty trails and unanswered questions. Frederick Steinbeck, the brother-in-law of one of the missing men, Klaus, began to investigate, tracing the path his relative would have taken. Klaus had written to Frederick from California, explaining that he would be traveling through Missouri in November and expected to reach Springfield by December 20th. But when New Year's Day passed without word from Klaus, Frederick began to question his disappearance. His search led him to Sullivan's trading post, where he was greeted warmly by Patrick and Shaw, who remembered Klaus quite well. Patrick was quick to express his concern for the missing man, describing him as a pleasant fellow who had spoken excellent English despite his strong accent. Patrick even produced a map, marking the route he had suggested to Klaus, a shortcut through the Devil's Backbone Trail that would save him a full day's travel. The brothers' story seemed plausible. They explained that Klaus had been eager to get home to his family in Springfield and had chosen to take the back trail to avoid bandits on the main road. They offered no excuses or signs of guilt, and Frederick left their trading post confused, but not yet suspicious. The brothers' story held together too well. However, something nagged at him, a feeling that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he made further inquiries along the route that he began to connect the dots. More and more reports began to surface, detailing the disappearances of travelers who had taken the same route. The Devil's Backbone Trail, once seen as a shortcut, was now emerging as a dangerous dead end. Yet, each time, the Sullivan brothers were able to deflect any suspicion with their charming hospitality and apparent concern for the missing men. By the time Frederick returned to Springfield in early 1865, he had gathered enough information to conclude that the disappearances were no mere coincidence. He began to connect the victims, prospectors, travelers, and men carrying substantial sums of gold. It was the perfect storm. Desperate men, large amounts of cash, and no law to stop it. The Sullivan brothers had become the center of a growing network of disappearances, and it was no longer a question of whether they were involved but how deep their involvement went. What worried Frederick even more was the ease with which the Sullivan brothers had manipulated him. He had no solid proof, only suspicions. He had walked into the trading post expecting to find answers, but instead, he had been met with smiles and calm reassurances. The brothers were well practiced at hiding the truth, carefully selecting their victims and making sure there were no loose ends. As the months passed, the pattern became undeniable. More men, all traveling alone or with a single companion, all vanished after visiting Sullivan's trading post. The community began to grow uneasy, but the local law enforcement was either too disinterested or too involved to act. Sheriff Thomas Dalton, a former Confederate cavalry officer, had become one of Patrick Sullivan's most trusted informants. While the sheriff would publicly dismiss the disappearances as the result of lawlessness in the region, privately, he knew something was amiss. But Patrick had earned his trust, and Dalton's hands were tied. The conspiracy was growing, but no one knew how deep it went. In private conversations, the whispers turned into fearful speculation, and those who began to question the brothers started to disappear as well. The Sullivan brothers had created a world where no one dared to look too closely, a world where those who could see the truth were silenced before they could speak it. As the number of missing travelers grew, so did the suspicions. Yet, with every disappearance, the brothers' grip on the community tightened. The brothers knew how to play the game. They had the perfect combination of charm and intimidation, and their carefully cultivated reputation as helpful, trustworthy businessmen gave them the protection they needed. In the growing climate of fear, no one dared to confront them directly. The disappearances were no longer a mystery. They were a grim reality. And those who had been keeping track, whether out of personal interest or fear, began to realize the terrifying truth. The brothers were not just opportunistic criminals. They were masterminds of a network that preyed on the vulnerable. The investigation that would ultimately bring down the Sullivan brothers didn't begin with law enforcement, but with a mother's determination. Elenina McGreedy, a widow whose only son had disappeared without a trace, would become the unlikely hero of this dark tale. A woman of remarkable courage and intelligence, she was not the typical grieving mother. Elenina had been raised in the aftermath of war, and her late husband had served as a Union officer during the Civil War. She had seen death before, But the disappearance of her son, Thomas, would lead her down a path that would forever change the course of the Ozarks' history. In March of 1866, Thomas McGreedy, a 19-year-old Union soldier who had survived the bloodshed of Shiloh, had sent his mother a letter from San Francisco. He had found moderate success in the gold fields and was planning to return to Illinois with enough money to purchase a farm. The letter was filled with excitement about his future and gratitude for his mother's sacrifices in raising him alone. Thomas promised that he would return by May, with enough gold to fulfill the dreams they had shared for years. When May passed without word from her son, Evelina assumed that he had simply been delayed by bad weather or had taken a longer route. However, as the weeks turned into months, her worries grew, and the letters she had eagerly awaited never arrived. By late summer, she could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong. Unlike many other families who had merely hoped for the best, Evelina took matters into her own hands. She was no stranger to investigative work. During the war, she had assisted with processing casualty reports and missing soldier inquiries, and the skills she had honed in those years would now serve her in a different capacity. Armed with detailed notes, maps, and a methodical plan, Evelina set out on a journey that would take her across the Ozarks, retracing her son's last known route. Unlike others who had simply spoken to local authorities, Evelina approached her search like a military operation. She methodically visited every establishment along the route that Thomas would have taken, armed with his photograph and a detailed physical description. She gathered what little information she could from shopkeepers, innkeepers, and travelers, making note of every inconsistency, every strange detail that seemed out of place. It was a slow process, but Evelina was determined. Her travels brought her to Sullivan's trading post in September 1866, and it was here that her investigation took a crucial turn. At first, Patrick Sullivan welcomed her with the warmth and sympathy he had shown countless other grieving relatives, offering her a detailed account of her son's visit. According to Patrick, Thomas had arrived at the post on April 15th, bought supplies, and spent several hours discussing the safest route for his journey home. Patrick even produced a map showing the route he had recommended to Thomas, the safer, longer road through Springfield, away from the more treacherous Devil's Backbone Trail. The brothers expressed genuine concern for Thomas, claiming that they had tried to persuade him to wait for a larger group to travel with, but that Thomas had insisted on continuing alone. Patrick's recounting seemed plausible, even sympathetic. The brothers appeared concerned, and the records they provided seemed meticulous. But something nagged at Evelina. The more she thought about her son's disappearance, the more questions arose, and one detail in particular haunted her. How had Patrick known so much about Thomas's personal circumstances? How had Patrick known that Thomas was her only child? How had he known about her son's promise to return with enough money to purchase a farm? And most unsettling of all, how had he known that Thomas was carrying exactly $3,000 in gold, a figure Evelina had never shared with anyone, not even her closest friends? It was this chilling realization that pushed Evelina into action. She had already suspected that the Sullivan brothers were somehow involved in her son's disappearance, but now she had confirmation that they knew far more than they should have. Patrick's ability to recall such specific details about Thomas's life made it clear that he had been watching him long before he ever set foot in their trading post. Evelina's suspicions were now confirmed, but she knew that proving it would be no easy task. She had no solid evidence, only the eerie sense that she had stumbled onto something much larger and more sinister than she had initially imagined. Yet, despite the growing danger, Evelina refused to back down. She understood that the only way to bring justice to her son and the many other missing travelers was to keep digging no matter the cost. With the full weight of her grief and determination, Evelina resolved to stay in Missouri and continue her investigation. She began to methodically compile information on every missing traveler she could find, building a comprehensive map of disappearances that stretched across the Ozarks. What she uncovered over the following months would not only change the course of the investigation but would also expose a vast criminal network that spanned the entire region. As Evelina McGreedy's investigation deepened, it became clear that the Sullivan brothers were not acting alone. What she had once suspected to be a simple series of isolated murders now revealed itself to be part of a much larger, far-reaching conspiracy that spanned the Ozarks. The Sullivan brothers had built an intricate network of co-conspirators, merchants, officials, and even religious figures, who had played crucial roles in facilitating their criminal enterprise. The brothers' ability to manipulate their community was not just based on their charm or their strategic location. It was built on an elaborate system of corruption that reached into the heart of local power structures. In the months that followed her encounter with the Sullivan brothers, Evelina began to track the disappearances of other travelers. She meticulously documented the details of each case, mapping out the routes taken by the victims and the locations where they had last been seen. A disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that tied the victims directly to the Sullivan brothers' trading post. Each one had arrived at Hellhound Crossing, spent time with the brothers, and then vanished without a trace. But what troubled Evelina more was the realization that many of the victims had been carrying significant amounts of gold and cash, making them prime targets for robbery and murder. Evelina's next breakthrough came when she discovered the existence of a hidden ledger kept by Patrick Sullivan, one that contained far more than just the names and descriptions of travelers. Beneath the false floor of the trading post, she uncovered a detailed record of the brothers' operations, listing not only the names of their victims but also the amounts of gold they had carried, the routes they had taken, and the psychological profiles of each target. It was clear that Patrick had been using these profiles to select the most profitable victims, those who were traveling alone, carrying substantial wealth, and whose disappearance would not be noticed immediately by loved ones. What made this discovery even more chilling was the realization that the Sullivan brothers had been in contact with a network of bandits who carried out the actual murders and robberies. These men were not random criminals but carefully selected accomplices who knew exactly when and where to strike. The bandits who worked for the Sullivan brothers were part of a well-oiled machine, one that knew how to avoid detection and cover up their tracks. The criminals in this network operated with military precision, using the information gathered by the brothers to ensure that each murder was carried out swiftly and efficiently. But the Sullivan brothers' conspiracy didn't stop with the bandits. Evelina soon learned that their network extended far beyond the walls of the trading post. Several local merchants had been laundering the stolen gold, exchanging it for currency at local banks, and investing the proceeds in legitimate businesses. These merchants knew exactly where the gold came from, but their involvement in the operation ensured that the Sullivan brothers' wealth was never traced back to the source of the crimes. Evelina also uncovered evidence that local officials, including Sheriff Thomas Dalton, had been involved in the conspiracy. Dalton, a former Confederate officer who had become one of the Sullivan brothers' most trusted allies, had been providing information about law enforcement activities in the area. He had tipped off the brothers about any investigations that might have threatened their operations, ensuring that they were always one step ahead of the law. It was no coincidence that when Evelina had approached local authorities with her concerns about her missing son, Sheriff Dalton had dismissed her suspicions, instead siding with the brothers and painting them as trustworthy citizens. The more Evelina uncovered, the more it became clear that the Sullivan brothers had not just built a criminal enterprise, they had built a shadow economy, one that existed beneath the surface of the Ozarks and was sustained by a web of corruption that reached into nearly every part of the community. From the local merchants who laundered the stolen gold to the officials who ensured that the crimes went unpunished, the network of criminals who supported the Sullivan brothers was vast and far-reaching. As she pieced together this complex web, Evelina knew that bringing the entire conspiracy down would require more than just exposing the brothers. She would need to uncover every part of their network, expose the corruption at every level, and dismantle the system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for so long. But doing so would not be easy. The Sullivan brothers had powerful allies, and they would stop at nothing to protect their operation. Evelina also realized that she could not do this alone. She needed help from someone who could not be bought or intimidated by the Sullivan brothers' network. And so, she turned to Captain James Hartford, a federal marshal based in St. Louis who had a reputation for integrity and incorruptibility. Her letter to Hartford, sent in early March 1867, was carefully crafted, presenting the evidence she had gathered in a systematic and methodical manner. It was her hope that Hartford would take her findings seriously and that he would be able to investigate the conspiracy with the full authority of the federal government behind him. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Evelina knew that the Sullivan brothers' days were numbered. But the road ahead would be dangerous. The deeper she dug, the more perilous the investigation became. The brothers had built their empire through manipulation, deceit, and violence, and they would do anything to protect it. Evelina's courage would soon be put to the test in ways she had never imagined. By early 1867, Evelina McGreedy's investigation had reached a boiling point. She had gathered irrefutable evidence that the Sullivan brothers were at the heart of a criminal empire that had been operating in plain sight for years. But the task of bringing them to justice was far from over. The brothers had powerful allies: officials, businessmen, and even local law enforcement, who ensured that their operations remained protected. For every lead Evelina uncovered, the brothers seemed to be one step ahead, using their vast network to cover up their crimes. Evelina knew that she could not continue the fight alone. The conspiracy was too vast, too entrenched in the local community. She needed someone with the power to take down the entire network, someone who could break through the corruption and ensure that the Sullivan brothers faced justice. Her answer came in the form of Captain James Hartford, a federal marshal from St. Louis, whom Evelina had known during the war. Hartford was a man known for his incorruptibility and his unwavering commitment to justice, and he was the only one who could be trusted to lead the charge against the Sullivan brothers. In early March 1867, Evelina sent a carefully written letter to Captain Hartford. In it, she laid out all of the evidence she had gathered: names, dates, locations, and the extensive network of criminals involved in the Sullivan brothers' operation. She didn't make wild accusations or jump to conclusions. Instead, she presented the facts in a systematic and methodical manner. Her goal was to convince Hartford to take action, to see the conspiracy for what it truly was: a sophisticated criminal operation that had wreaked havoc on the lives of countless innocent people. Captain Hartford's response was swift. He recognized the gravity of Evelina's findings and immediately made plans to travel to Missouri to investigate. But Hartford understood the danger of the task ahead. The Sullivan brothers had their hooks deep in the local community, and it would be foolish to alert them to his investigation too soon. The federal marshal made arrangements to travel under an assumed name, keeping his true intentions hidden from the local authorities who might tip off the brothers. As Hartford made his way to the Ozarks, Evelina's investigation continued to unfold. She had spent months painstakingly collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and tracking down missing travelers. By the time Hartford arrived, she had mapped out the entire conspiracy, connecting the dots between the Sullivan brothers, the local merchants, and the officials who had been complicit in their crimes. But what Evelina couldn't have known was that the brothers were already aware of her investigation. They had been keeping close tabs on her, watching her every move. And as soon as Hartford's arrival became known, the Sullivan brothers and their network began to mobilize. The final confrontation began on the morning of March 18, 1867. In a coordinated operation, federal agents descended on several key locations: Sullivan's trading post, Cornelius McBride's currency exchange, and the homes of suspected co-conspirators. The raid was swift and decisive, designed to catch the conspirators off guard and prevent them from fleeing or destroying evidence. At Sullivan's trading post, federal agents forced their way inside, only to find the very thing Evelina had suspected all along: a hidden chamber beneath the floorboards, containing ledgers that documented the names of the victims, the amounts of gold they had carried, and the routes they had taken. But the ledgers were not the only thing the agents found. They also discovered personal belongings from the victims: watches, jewelry, family photographs, and letters that told the heartbreaking stories of men who had been traveling home to their loved ones, only to meet a brutal and untimely end. The most chilling discovery came when agents found the psychological profiles written by Patrick Sullivan. These detailed notes described how the brothers had carefully selected their victims, analyzing everything from their travel habits to their emotional state. The profiles were a testament to the cold, calculating nature of the operation, showing that the brothers had used sophisticated techniques to identify the most profitable targets. At Cornelius McBride's currency exchange, Agents uncovered a money laundering operation that had been converting the stolen gold into legitimate currency. McBride, a prominent figure in Springfield's financial district, had been working closely with the Sullivan brothers to help them clean their ill-gotten gains. His business was just one node in a vast network that included merchants, bankers, and even city officials, all of whom had been profiting from the stolen gold. The raid on Sheriff Thomas Dalton's home was perhaps the most shocking. Inside his personal safe, investigators found correspondence between Dalton and Patrick Sullivan dating back to 1864. One letter from Sullivan to Dalton, dated September 1866, discussed the disappearance of Elenina's son, Thomas McGreedy, and suggested that it might be time for her to join her boy on the Devil's Backbone Trail. The letter revealed that Dalton had not only been aware of the murders but had actively participated in planning them. This discovery was a blow to the investigation, exposing the full depth of the corruption that had allowed the Sullivan brothers to operate with impunity for so long. The evidence gathered during the raid was damning, and it was enough to bring the entire conspiracy to light. Patrick and Shaw Sullivan were arrested, along with several of their co-conspirators, including McBride and Sheriff Dalton. The federal marshal's swift and decisive action had dismantled the network that had enabled the brothers to carry out their brutal crimes for so long. But the raid was just the beginning. The trial of the Sullivan brothers and their accomplices would reveal the full extent of their operation and expose the widespread corruption that had allowed them to operate without fear of punishment. The case would become a landmark moment in the history of law enforcement, showing how even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be brought down through persistence, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The aftermath of the Sullivan brothers' capture and the subsequent raids rocked the Ozarks to their core. What had once seemed like a quiet, lawless corner of Missouri was now exposed as the breeding ground for one of the most sophisticated and brutal criminal enterprises in American history. The evidence uncovered by Elenina McGreedy, Federal Marshal James Hartford, and the team of investigators was overwhelming. What had been dismissed as a series of random disappearances was now a full-blown criminal conspiracy that had claimed the lives of at least 127 victims. The trial that followed was one of the most highly anticipated in Missouri history. Patrick and Shaw Sullivan, along with their co-conspirators, were charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and theft. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence: the ledgers documenting the victims, the profiles detailing their selection process, the personal belongings found at Sullivan's trading post, and the confessions of several accomplices who had turned state's evidence. Despite their attempts to portray themselves as innocent businessmen, the Sullivan brothers could not escape the weight of their actions. In February 1868, after a lengthy trial, the Sullivan brothers were convicted on all counts. The court found them guilty of 127 murders, spanning 3 years of calculated violence. The brothers' chilling confession during their trial revealed the cold, methodical nature of their crimes. Patrick, the more calculating of the two, explained with disturbing pride how they had built their operation. "We weren't bandits," he had said. "Bandits are crude, impulsive creatures. We were businessmen who understood that information is more valuable than weapons, and that systematic planning eliminates most risks while maximizing profits." Shaw Sullivan, the more brutal of the two, offered little in his defense, but his confession revealed the sheer violence that had been employed in their operation. He described how the murders were often carried out swiftly and efficiently, with the victims unaware of their fate until it was too late. Despite the horror of their actions, Shaw remained emotionless throughout the proceedings, giving the court no hint of remorse. On February 14, 1868, Patrick and Shaw Sullivan were executed by hanging. The execution drew a crowd of over 3,000 people, many of them family members of the victims who had traveled from across the country to witness justice being served. For Elenina McGreedy, who had spent years searching for the truth about her son's disappearance, the execution brought a sense of closure, but it also left her with a lingering sense of sorrow. She had uncovered the truth, but the price of that knowledge had been steep. Sheriff Thomas Dalton and 12 of the Sullivan brothers' accomplices also faced justice. Dalton, who had once been one of the Sullivan brothers' most trusted allies, was sentenced to life in federal prison. His betrayal of the people he had sworn to protect was seen as a betrayal of his duty as a lawman. Cornelius McBride, the currency exchange owner who had laundered the stolen gold, was sentenced to 20 years in prison, as were several other conspirators who had aided the brothers in their operations. The community of Springfield, where the Sullivan brothers had been seen as upstanding citizens, was left in shock. Many had been unaware of the brothers' true activities, and the revelation of their crimes was a bitter blow to a town that had relied on their seemingly honest business dealings. Several local businesses were forced to close when their connections to the Sullivan brothers were exposed, and the town's financial district was forever tainted by the scandal. Even the church, which had received donations made with stolen gold, found itself facing a crisis of faith as the full extent of the brothers' operation came to light. For Elenina, the trial and execution of the Sullivan brothers brought no true peace. While she had succeeded in bringing justice to her son and the other victims, the emotional toll of her journey was immense. She had learned the harsh truth about her son's final moments, and that knowledge would haunt her for the rest of her life. Despite her personal grief, Elenina's courage and determination were hailed as heroic. She became a symbol of perseverance in the face of unimaginable loss, and her efforts to uncover the truth were praised in newspapers across the country. In the aftermath, the federal government responded by increasing its presence in the region. The Sullivan case had exposed the vulnerability of America's transportation networks to organized criminal activity, and the federal authorities were determined to prevent such an operation from happening again. New patrol routes were established along major travel corridors, and communication systems were put in place to allow law enforcement agencies in different states to coordinate investigations. While the Sullivan brothers were dead, their legacy lived on in the lessons learned from their operation. The case served as a stark reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most dangerous criminals are those who seem most eager to help. The Sullivan brothers had succeeded for years, not through brute force, but through their ability to exploit the trust of their community and the vulnerabilities of their victims. For Elenina, the battle was over, but the scars remained. She returned to Illinois and resumed her quiet life on the family farm, but she continued to research the disappearances of travelers in other states, convinced that the Sullivan brothers were just one piece of a much larger criminal network. She never completed her final letter to federal authorities, but her notes suggested that similar operations were taking place in Colorado, Nebraska, and Texas. As time passed, the name Sullivan became synonymous with fear in the Ozarks. The trading post at Hellhound Crossing was burned to the ground by federal agents, and the site was abandoned. Even decades later, travelers would avoid the area, unnerved by the knowledge of what had occurred there. Some spoke of strange happenings, of ghosts that haunted the old trails, while others whispered of descendants of the conspiracy still living in the area, guarding the old secrets. The Sullivan brothers' story was one of greed, manipulation, and the tragic consequences of blind trust. And in the end, their downfall was a testament to the power of a mother's love and determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Even after the execution of Patrick and Shaw Sullivan, and the dismantling of their criminal empire, questions remained. The full extent of their operation was never fully revealed, and the long-lasting impact of their crimes continued to haunt the Ozarks for years to come. While the immediate aftermath of the Sullivan brothers' downfall brought a sense of closure for many, the deeper mysteries surrounding their actions refused to fade into the past. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Sullivan case was the discovery that their network extended far beyond the brothers themselves. The conspiracy that had enabled them to carry out their brutal murders was not a random collection of criminals. It was a carefully orchestrated system that had involved men and women from all walks of life. Merchants, bankers, even members of the clergy had been complicit in laundering the stolen gold, and many of these people had escaped justice. The Sullivan brothers may have been the masterminds, but their operation had been sustained by an entire web of corruption that reached into the very fabric of the Ozark communities. Despite the detailed confessions of the Sullivan brothers, many felt that the true scale of their crimes was still hidden. During their trial, Patrick Sullivan had alluded to special arrangements for certain high-value targets, but he died before he could provide further details. Some historians believe that the brothers may have been involved in the disappearances of several prominent individuals whose deaths were never officially linked to their conspiracy. These included a California state legislator who vanished while traveling to Washington, D.C., a wealthy mine owner who disappeared between Missouri and Illinois, and at least 3 federal officials whose deaths were attributed to unrelated causes. In 1902, 35 years after the Sullivan brothers' execution, a discovery was made that would reignite interest in the case. Construction workers building a railroad line through the Ozarks stumbled upon a mass grave along the Old Devil's Backbone Trail. The remains of 47 people were unearthed, many of whom had been buried hastily in shallow graves. Personal belongings found with the bodies matched descriptions of the Sullivan case victims, confirming that even the brothers' detailed confessions had failed to reveal the full extent of their operation. This discovery raised disturbing questions. Had the Sullivan brothers been operating longer than anyone realized? Were there more victims whose remains had never been found? The discovery of additional victims decades after the brothers' executions cast a long shadow over the case. It was possible that the Sullivan network had extended beyond the Ozarks, reaching into other states where similar disappearances had occurred. Elenina McGreedy, who had dedicated years of her life to uncovering the truth about her son's disappearance, had believed that the Sullivan brothers were just one part of a larger, organized criminal operation. Her investigation, though groundbreaking, had only scratched the surface. According to her notes, she had begun to suspect that similar networks were operating in Colorado, Nebraska, and Texas, but she never lived to complete her research. Her final letter to federal authorities, which she had started before her death in 1894, hinted at these connections but was never finished. The unanswered questions surrounding the Sullivan brothers' operation raised troubling possibilities. Was their network part of a larger trend of criminal enterprises that preyed on travelers during the chaotic years following the Civil War? How many other criminal operations were out there, hidden behind the facades of seemingly respectable businesses? The case also raised questions about the limits of law enforcement. How had such a sophisticated operation been able to operate for so long without detection? And perhaps most chilling of all, were there still survivors from the Sullivan network who had managed to escape justice and were continuing their activities elsewhere? Despite the collapse of their criminal empire, the Sullivan brothers' legacy continued to haunt the Ozarks. The trading post at Hellhound Crossing, where so many innocent lives had been stolen, was burned to the ground by federal agents after the investigation concluded. The site itself remained a place of unease, avoided by travelers for decades. Some locals claimed that the spirits of the victims still lingered in the area, warning those who passed by of the dangers that had once lurked there. Others believed that the descendants of the conspiracy's survivors still lived in the region, keeping the old code of silence that had protected the network for so many years. The most disturbing aspect of the Sullivan case was the realization that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear the most trustworthy. The brothers had succeeded for years not through brute force or raw violence, but through their ability to gain the trust of their victims and the local community. They had exploited the natural human tendency to trust those who seem kind, helpful, and familiar. The lessons of Hellhound Crossing about trust, manipulation, and the dangers of believing in the goodness of others remain disturbingly relevant today. The federal investigation into the Sullivan brothers marked a turning point in American law enforcement. The case highlighted the need for a coordinated effort to track missing persons across state lines and to prevent similar criminal networks from flourishing. While the brothers' empire had been destroyed, their story serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist beneath the surface of everyday life. In the years following their trial, federal authorities established regular patrol routes along major travel corridors and implemented new communication systems to allow law enforcement in different states to share information. Yet despite these measures, the legacy of the Sullivan brothers' operation continues to linger, a chilling reminder that some mysteries, no matter how thoroughly investigated, may never be fully solved. As the dust settled and the Sullivan brothers' network was dismantled, the Ozarks would never be the same. Their empire of death and deception had been brought to light, but the questions they left behind still echoed in the hills. How many more victims had they claimed? How many more criminal networks like theirs were still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike? The legacy of the Sullivan brothers is a chilling reminder that evil can often hide in plain sight, masquerading as respectability and kindness. Their downfall was a victory for justice, but it also left us with a darker understanding of human nature and the dangers of misplaced trust. If you've been captivated by this dark chapter in history, make sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more chilling tales. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on the Sullivan brothers conspiracy and share this story with others who enjoy historical mysteries.